Welcome everyone. So good to see you and have you with us here. Some of you are from different locations and time zones outside of the Bay Area and California, so we're especially grateful to have you with us. My name is Parisa Karim. I'm the director for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, and it's a real thrill to host today's program. I'm going to say very little, and then I'm going to pass it off to the two young women who are our hosts today. I'll just say that this summer I attended several Black Lives Matters events, and it was such a thrill to see so many young people in the streets of all persuasions, races, genders. And I carried a sign at one protest in Berkeley, and there was about 5,000 people, and my sign said Iranian Americans for Black Lives. And about 5 times over the course of the march, people asked me if they could hold my sign and I could take a picture of them. And it turned out they were indeed Iranian Americans like me. And what it said to me was, this is a moment that is very significant for our community, and also one in which we're grappling with how to participate and how to have a vocabulary. So when Roya Ahmadi and Jasmine Javaheri, who independently sought to engage with the center through these conversations about race and racism after the death of George Floyd, after the murder of George Floyd, I was very excited by the sort of synergy that they created. Roya is a high school student at Monte Vista High School in Cupertino. She's about ready to graduate and she's doing her college applications. She was a center intern with us last summer, and she brought so much energy and life to the center. And Jasmine is a soon-to-be senior at UC Santa Cruz in critical race and ethnic studies and an art major. And the two of them have really conceived of a 3-part series, and this is the second one. The first one was a Instagram live interview with the comedian and activist Tehran von Gasri. And today's program is with 2 people I very much admire and respect, and I think you will too once you hear them speak, in which they're going to talk about race and racial representations in the past and present. And without further ado, we'll hand it over to our 2 summer fellows, and I'll just remind you that we would love to have you on our newsletter mailing list, and please follow us on social media. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Persis. Hello, everyone. My name is Roya Ahmadi. Thank you all so much for joining. It's really critical that we engage in these conversations always, but particularly now after the murder of George Floyd, when our nation is really woken up to the horrible impacts of systemic racism. And so I'm really grateful to the center and Persis for allowing Jasmine and I to lead so much of this initiative and engage in this conversation today. So I will go ahead and introduce one of our panelists, and Jasmine can go ahead and introduce the other. So Dr. Parisa Vaziri is an assistant professor of comparative literature and Near Eastern studies at Cornell University. Her research explores the legacies of Indian Ocean slavery through visual culture. She's interested in the interconnections between the histories of enslavement in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, and complex genealogies of racial differences that emerge through the long durée of global African enslavement. We're really grateful to Dr. Vaziri for being with us today. And Jasmine, I'll go ahead and pass it on to you.
Thank you, Roya. My name is Jasmine Javaheri, and like Roya said, we're both really excited to be continuing this 3-part series and having Dr. Kasravi and Dr. Vaziri join us. I believe sometimes these conversations can be really uncomfortable and difficult to have, especially with some of our older generations and even people I'm surrounded with. I felt like we wanted to have these conversations but didn't have the tools or knew the language of how to navigate them. So I'm hoping that this conversation inspires people young and old to start these conversations with people that they may not have thought of before. And I wanted to introduce Dr. Kasravi. Dr. Niaz Kasravi is a national expert and an advocate on criminal justice, social justice, and racial justice. She was previously working for the NAACP, and she's the founder and director of the Avalan Institute, a research, advocacy, and training institute. And she has more than 18 years of experience leading campaigns across the country, including on police accountability, racial profiling, and death penalty abolition. Now I wanted to hand it over to Dr. Vaziri and Dr. Kasravi if you wanted to say anything else on introducing yourselves to all our wonderful guests.
That was a great introduction. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks again for inviting me to be part of this.
Yeah, same here. I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm grateful for the space and the conversations that are so important to be had, especially right now. And I think you covered most of the introduction, and we'll get into my work a little bit throughout the discussion. So I'll leave space for that.
That was great. So we wanted to start off by asking, what is your impression of the conversations surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement? We've seen there's a lot of panels and a lot of other organizations have been having similar talks to these. And we wanted to ask how you reacted to these and how you felt compelled to respond to it in the work you're doing. Dr. Kasravi in advocacy and Dr. Vaziri in academia.
I think that working on issues impacting the Black community, particularly here in the US, has always been a central point of the work I do. I think when you study criminal justice and when you work on policing issues, it automatically is a focal point, right? But I think really diving deep into and fully understanding outside of what I was studying in academia, what the impact of our criminal justice system and just white supremacy and racism in general has been and continues to be in Black communities and on Black families. I really grasped that firsthand but through my work at the NAACP. And I think that currently it's more important than ever to center the voices and experiences of Black communities and Black individuals around the issue of racial and social justice. It doesn't mean that other voices and experiences are not important or valuable. It just means that recognition of each community's unique experiences in this country is really important, and recognizing when it comes to things like the issues that I work on, police brutality, racial injustice in many spheres, for example, yes, many people suffer from it, but who bears the brunt is often Black people in America. And I think so it's been a constant throughout my work. I think one of the things that in this moment has changed is twofold, right? In the larger community in the US, we're getting folks talking about these issues that, previously, were not even around the table or even close to it, right? You have even elected officials like the governor of New York standing up and saying, I'm with the protesters, right? So you got the needle moved a lot on who's engaged and who's willing to recognize and actually take some action, which is really good. Within our own community, I think one of my goals has always been to get our community involved in this dialogue, not only when it impacts us through like immigration policy and whatnot, but really because we are a part of the fabric of this country, and the impact that racism has on our community has the same roots as, the impact that racism has on the Black community and other communities of color, right? It's been really difficult to get our community around the table on these issues, talking about racial profiling and policing issues, because it's always been like, it doesn't really affect us, it's their issue. But there's definitely been an openness. I've spent a lot of time talking about the issues that I work on with different Iranian organizations, which is really great to see. And I hope that it's not just a blip and something that we should be doing now because it's relevant in social media and people are talking about it, but I hope it's something that lasts and we stay engaged.
Yeah, and I can just kind of echo what Niaz was saying. I think I've been encouraged. So I work within an academic context, and the caveat is kind of like my experiences are couched within that framework, but I've been encouraged by certain changes I see within academia amongst my colleagues. So I also, I've been centering Blackness in my work, from the very beginning of my academic career. And there was never all that much interest in it, at least on behalf of, say, the Iranian studies community. But lately, I've been noticing more and more engagement from my colleagues in Iranian studies, but also just more generally in academia. So I come from a comparative literature background, and I'm going to be working as the course leader in my department next year, which means that I help TAs, graduate students, construct and refine their syllabi. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there, like after the national protests over George Floyd's death, there was this sudden interest amongst graduate students who were otherwise studying very different things. They might be studying like 18th century French literature or something, suddenly interested in crafting their syllabi around questions of racial justice. So I'm encouraged by that. And at the same time, I'll also echo the other aspect of what Niaz said, which is that I hope it's not just a moment. I hope it's not just this sudden trend. We have a couple panels and then it's over and everyone kind of goes back to normal. You saw that a little bit with the Black Lives Matter hashtag that became really popular. I don't know, at one point even Amazon had on their website a Black Lives Matter hashtag, and it was like this sudden moment of reckoning. What does it mean for this big company to have that hashtag on their website? But you saw all different kinds, not just people in government, but social influencers sort of riding the Black Lives Matter bandwagon. And then it was slowly starting to disappear. I don't really see it as much. So I am a little bit concerned about it being a trend that passes. I hope it's not that. I hope we continue the conversation.
Thank you both for sharing that. And I think I definitely agree with what you both kind of mentioned of this conversation actually continuing. And I think a large part of that, I think it's been wonderful that we in some ways have been able to start conversations with our family members and friends. But one thing that I'm also really interested in is Iranian Americans, especially non-Black Iranian Americans, and our involvement in actually advocating for changes. And so Niaz, because you currently with the Avalan Institute have worked on the cases of Bijan Raisa, the police shooting against an Iranian American, and Shayan Mazure, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name, but I'm curious to see if you see a different reaction from Iranian Americans to police violence or hate crimes against Black individuals versus other Iranian Americans. And I'm curious if you think this is an example of perhaps the racial blindness of Iranians, or does violence against Iranian Americans cause the scary realization that Iranian Americans aren't exempt from hate in the US and that we actually need to be, and should that show us that we should be actively participating in advocacy?
Well, it should. I mean, it should in that it's important for us to work on issues that impact our communities. But beyond that, I think we shouldn't just be active on things that matter just because it affects us, right? That's a very kind of like selfish way of living, right? We should be active against racism and bias and hatred and hate crimes, no matter who it happens to, because that's just the right thing to do. That's the only way we're going to make America or any other place in the world great again, right? Is when we care about what happens to other people beyond just ourselves, right? So that's number one. I think that, and for people who don't know, I encourage you to look up the cases of Bijan Raisa and Shayan Mazure. Bijan was an unarmed young Iranian American in Northern Virginia, and he was shot dead by park police officers on the GW Parkway. And it's been, his family was posting today that it's been 1,000 days without their son, and they have zero answers, and zero people have been held accountable even though the entire video is on camera. And Shayan's case is closer to home for us in California. In South Orange County, he was killed by a known white supremacist as he was playing pool in a local pub. And so to your question around, you know, have Iranians been more responsive to those cases? Yes, of course. To a great extent, our community has expressed outrage. Organizations that represent us have issued statements. Has everyone connected this to the larger problem of racism and white supremacy in America? Is debatable. I think a lot more people have. What I also see is that often it's the younger generations who are more amenable and open to seeing those connections, and it's harder, I think, for older generations to come around and recognize what we might have in common with the Black community or the Latinx community or any other immigrant communities, right? So yeah, there has been definitely a lot more attention to these two cases because they, you know, could have been any of us, and it's, you know, it's hurtful when it's so close to home. But I have to tell you, we could have done better, and we should do better. Even for Shayan's case, for example, we held a vigil for him outside of the courthouse where his case was being handled. It was on his 25th birthday. What would have been his 25th birthday. And we promoted it through, you know, all kinds of social media and Iranian radio stations and whatnot. And there were some challenges in terms of that his birthday fell on Chharshanbe Suri. It was middle of the week. It was raining a little earlier maybe, but, you know, it turned out to be nice in the afternoon. But, you know, out of such a large population of Iranians we have in Southern California and in LA and Orange County particularly, we got maybe 50 people. And so, you know, I think it goes to the point of like really questioning what showing up, even for ourselves, really mean. It doesn't matter how many times you posted about the case or, you know, how do you show up for your own and others when this happens? So I think we still have a little bit of work to do. And I think there's definitely some racial blindness for a lot of people in our community. Perhaps it's generational mostly, though that's not the rule. And that's kind of like a general statement, at least based on my observations. But we could do better on both fronts. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
I wanted to ask Dr. Vaziri if you wanted to comment on anything Dr. Kasravi said. I also have noticed a kind of maybe not even just an ignorance, but just kind of a sense of ignoring when others, especially like you said, like in other communities and sometimes even our own, the problem of showing up, I've noticed, has come up a lot, even with younger generations. I sometimes notice even in the university setting, some of my classmates not willing to have these discussions because they feel it's too political or that it's too uncomfortable to be having these conversations. And it's really hard to try to convince someone who doesn't feel like it's the right time, or if it's just too hard of a conversation to have, if it's someone my age. And I feel like it's even more difficult when you're trying to talk to someone who's older than you about that. And I wanted to ask if either of you have any advice or could comment on how you believe would be the best way to approach this situation, because a lot of times, as unfortunate as it is, I do see that the Iranian community will show up more if it has to do with one of our own instead of someone from another community.
Yeah, I want to touch on this question a little bit later in connection to something else that I want to say, but just regarding the Shayan Mazure case, I'm thinking about this because I was in Southern California in 2015. I was in graduate school still then. And I don't even remember hearing about the case. And it's surprising to me that I didn't know that. I've read about it since then, but at that time when I was in Southern California, why didn't I know about this? And what does that say about the kinds of networks that we build you know, for the purpose of showing up for each other in these kinds of situations. I'm also wondering, Niaz, if you think, does it have anything to do with sort of the infrequency of these events? Because, you know, at least in the case of Black Lives Matter, Black people are killed all the time. And so Black people are constantly on their guard and sort of know that at any moment it can happen to them, so they show up. Whereas with Iranians, I wonder if one of the reasons why people were not showing up or why they weren't even connected to this event is because it was sort of seen as this kind of outlier thing that happened, but it was an exception to the rule, and that, you know, it's unlikely that that's going to happen to me, so I don't need to kind of, you know, start a movement around it. Do you think that that's related in any way?
I think so. I think it definitely prompts you to do more if you see it every day, if you are worried about it happening to you every day. I think it also has a lot to do with the fact that oftentimes we can shield, not everyone in the Iranian community, but a lot of people in the Iranian community, we can just shield ourselves from this stuff, right? So it happens, you know, the police shootings and the hate crimes, you know, I feel like we have a lot more hate crimes than people talk about, right? But to the level where someone is like literally outwardly killed because of their background, right? It's rare, right? So I think when we felt a lot of the burden of racism in America has had to do with, you know, foreign policy issues. When things bubble to the surface, or when there's a clash, or where there's an international event where somehow Iran is implicated or thought to be, you know, a part of it, and there's a crackdown here at home with roundups, with Muslim bans, with registration for specific people, including Iranians. Those are the times we felt, I think, a lot of the brunt. And in those moments, if you look back through history, our community has shown up. We've protested, we've engaged, all the organizations have been like lobbying on the Hill, and, you know, but then that kind of, you know, kind of fades away. Things kind of normalize until they bubble again. But then we're able to kind of get back to our lives and go on vacation and go back to school and just kind of stay away from it, right? But it's going to keep rearing its ugly head. And I think the more we recognize that, like I said, beyond it just being the right thing to do, the better off our future generations will be. I mean, even in these two cases, so for both cases, you know, we were able to get the NAACP, Amnesty International, a whole host of other civil and human rights organizations to like show up and support, just because I had been active in those spaces, right? Because they knew who I was, they knew my work. Now, Persis has heard me say this many times. Imagine if there was like more people in those spaces. How easy would it be for folks to show up when stuff happens to us, be it, you know, these really egregious cases like Bijan's and Shayan's, or, you know, things that are more common in our community, which is like the immigration policy stuff, right? So I think definitely has something to do with how frequent it happens, or how possible people think that it might happen to them. But you know, this is our reality, and we got to work with what we got. I'm really hopeful though, that as we have more generations of young Iranian Americans growing up in the diaspora with these issues, and having friends and contacts in different communities where they can actually see that this is beyond, you know, an article you read in the paper or something you see on TV. I'm just hopeful at how open and engaged the younger generation is, who's growing up in a very different context than even, you know, I did.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. And one thing that I am kind of curious to transition to is understanding a lot of, especially as you mentioned, younger generations seem to be engaging in these conversations more, and are interested in kind of tackling, at least at this moment in time, like the anti-Blackness in our communities and stuff like that. But I'm curious to see kind of how these ideas of anti-Blackness have been inherited, or have kind of pass through generations. And Dr. Vaziri, as your research and expertise is in this area, one thing that I think even I've noticed is very common among Iranian Americans, Iranians, even myself, I didn't know about Iran's history of slavery until kind of doing some research before approaching Persis. And that's completely shocking and really scary to think that generations of people, even though slavery was not abolished that long ago in Iran, have no idea of this history. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the erasure of slavery in Iranian history and how these representations of race have impacted perceptions of race and especially perceptions of Blackness in Iran and its diaspora.
You know, on the one hand, this is a very simple question to answer, and on the other hand, it's actually quite complicated. So I'm going to try to approach it in a few different ways. But to speak to this question of, you know, why didn't you hear about this history of slavery, right? I mean, it's not something that we have a lot of research on, even though Iran has a very long history of slavery. I mean, it's a very old country, it's an old region, and slavery is an ancient institution. You know, slavery developed with the advent of agriculture. It's not just this modern invention. So when I ask you, what do you think of when you think of slavery, you have maybe a few associations in mind. You might think of like men in chains or scenes of slaves picking cotton or working on sugar plantations, scenes that you might see in a film like 12 Years a Slave, right? Because, well, I mean, part of that is the hegemony of Hollywood and other kinds of hegemony that it's connected to. But it's just the case that we have a lot more information about the history of slavery in the transatlantic world and far, far less information about slavery in the Indian Ocean. So when I talk about slavery in Iran, in the back of my mind, I'm not thinking of just this one isolated country. I think that's a very artificial way of approaching this question. You can't really disconnect the slavery that happened in Iran from the region around it in West Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa. So this sort of tendency to approach the question this way through the framework of what is this history of slavery in Iran is a legacy of the development of the nation state that's become so natural to us to think within these sort of homogenized units. But so it's true that we have sort of this dearth of sources, and that's one of the reasons why it's taken so long for there to be any research at all, although that's not the only reason, it's one of the reasons. But we do have sources that describe African slaves working on sugar plantations in Khuzestan, in the southwestern region of Iran, during the Sasanian era. So that's between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD, okay? That's long before the advent of sugar cultivation in the Caribbean, which is the association we're used to having when we think about slavery and sugar. But in fact, sugar cultivation was happening in the Near East much longer, much farther back in time. And it was, Europeans were introduced to methods for sugar cultivation. Some scholars think because of the encounter during the Crusades, after which they sort of transmitted sugar cultivation to the Mediterranean and then the Caribbean. So this is just one small connection that we can make between the history of slavery we're familiar with, most of us are familiar with regard to transatlantic history, and histories of slavery in the Indian Ocean. And what's interesting to me, what's become interesting is the way these kinds of connections have become so irrelevant. Like, it's not that people don't know about this. It's not that people don't know that there were slaves in Iran working on sugar plantations in the Sasanian era, it's that these kinds of details are so irrelevant. And part of that is just because, you know, history is itself, in the way that we're used to thinking and speaking about it, is a pretty modern discipline. We don't really have disciplinary historiography in the sense that we understand it in Iran prior to the 20th century even. I mean, we have things like medieval chronicles, but we don't have this kind of critical engagement with sources and archives that we understand as the task of a historian. So then if you sort of think about the way that that discipline developed, the way that historiography developed in Iran, it was very much connected to projects of nationalism. And nationalism, you know, in a very loose sense, is connected to thinking about a region as this kind of homogenous unit that's become naturalized, something with the name we know today as Iran. But it's also this desire to, at least historically it was the case for nationalism in Iran, that there was a desire to produce only positive associations with our history. And how that played out was connections that people tried to make between modern Iran and pre-Islamic Iran. So this sort of concerted effort to distance Iran from Islamic history, those centuries during which Iran was and is still a Muslim country. So people have different ideas about this history. A lot has been written on it, actually. Part of the thing that people say is, you know, there was this idea in the late 19th century, early 20th century that came out of the discipline of comparative philology, where these scholars were finding connections between Persian and Sanskrit and ancient Latin, Greek, trying to kind of make connections between languages. It became known as the Indo-European thesis, right? And that was connected to a racial narrative that tried to build racial connections between Iranians, Northern Indians, and Europeans, and connected to a whole different other colonial history that has to do with Great Britain and India. But so what I'm trying to get at is that slavery was simply irrelevant to people. I mean, why would people be invested in thinking about this history? And if you think about it, it's the same case, you know, when we think about women in history. For so long, we didn't really have any material about women in our history until feminist historians came along and did that work. We didn't have information about working classes, ordinary people, peasantry. And in many ways, that kind of work is a lot harder to do because it's quite easy to write a history based on documents that have been left behind by the ruling classes, because those documents have been left there to be preserved for that reason. Whereas with the history of slavery, I mean, you really, if you think about it, there's no reason why there would be sources. I mean, why would slave traders be interested in cataloging their purchase of slaves? In fact, there's a lot more archival material like that for the Atlantic slave trade because it happened in a more modern period, but also for other reasons. We just don't have those. We don't have even information about individual ships that were specialized for carrying slaves. We don't have things like that. We don't have a digital database cataloging voyages from the eastern coast of Africa through the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, like we do for West Africa to the Caribbean and the United States and South America. So some of this is just really a lack of information, but I'm also trying to make another point that lack of information is itself tied to power. And I can bring up an anecdote that we sort of briefly alluded to during our last conversation about this experience I had presenting on research on slavery in Iran at a conference in 2016 with another woman, Bita Bagholizadeh. She also writes about slavery in Iran, and another woman as well. And after that presentation, a woman in the audience stood up and she was very upset by the presentations. And she said something along the lines of, well, yes, we had slaves in my family, but they were very happy slaves. I later found out that that woman was actually a pretty important person, that she had donated a lot of money to these kinds of academic events related to Iranian studies. And I bring it up because it's not unconnected. There's a very intimate connection between the way power is distributed and the way knowledge is produced. And people have interests in not knowing about this slavery, this history, not really not letting this history to exist, even though it's quite difficult for it to exist, as I've been suggesting, because of the archival problems and because we don't have any slave testimonies. That's another issue, you know, you think about how important slave narratives were to historiographies of slavery in the transatlantic world, how important slave narratives are to the field of African diaspora studies. Think about that. We don't have any narratives. And so I'm also very cautious about the work that's being done currently, because not just for Iran, but, you know, slavery in the Ottoman Empire, that kind of work is being done in the absence of connections to the experience of people who are actually enslaved. So what kind of a history can you write without access to that experience? Obviously, it's going to be very problematic. So, I mean, maybe I'll address this again later on, but I want to say that we don't have a history of slavery in Iran. We don't have that history yet. It's true that we have, a book was published in the past few years, and we have a few articles that have been written about it. But given all of these issues, we have to really question what kind of knowledge this is that people are producing and who it's for as well. I didn't even get into the question of representation, but I'll sort of just wrap this up quickly. I think because of the issues that I just mentioned, it's really important to be methodologically innovative in terms of thinking about how we can create relationships to this past, because obviously we can't rely on traditional historiographical methods. We have to be inventive. And one of the things that we don't have slave narratives, but we have plenty of cultural allusions to this history. So for example, I'll bring up a figure because I think that everyone is familiar with it. Haji Firuz and the tradition of siyahbazi or blackface theater. And what's really interesting about both the practice of siyahbazi and of Haji Firuz for me is not so much that, yeah, I mean, personally, I see this figure as connected to the history of slavery because he wears blackface, he talks about his arbab, his owner, he's a self-deprecating character. But what's really interesting to me about Haji Firuz is the narratives that have been constructed around him and the way that those narratives have been so persistent and powerful. So there was a linguist a couple of decades ago that came up with this really wildly speculative theory about how Haji Firuz's blackface is not connected to Black people, it's not connected to African slaves, but that it's a remnant of an ancient Sumerian mourning ritual. So women were blackening their faces in pre-Islamic history for this festival in commemoration of a Sumerian god. Obviously, there's no way to prove this hypothesis, right? It's a totally wild speculation that doesn't even make sense. And there are many other narratives like that. What I think is so interesting is that people still buy these narratives. And it's not just that they buy them, it's that they rally around them. So that I really think if you ask the majority of Iranians, do you think siyahbazi is a racist practice? Do you think it's problematic? The majority will say no, and they refer back to these theories that really are totally baseless. I just point that out because I think, you know, as Niaz was saying, we really do have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of resistance in our community, both in the Iranian community in Iran and in the Iranian diasporic community, to even addressing not only anti-Blackness, but Blackness, that we have Black people in Iran. We are Black, you know, we're not just, we all don't look like me and Niaz and you and everyone else that I see on this Zoom screen. You know, we have Black people in our community, and they're deeply offended by the fact that we don't address them as part of us, that we don't see ourselves as Black as well.
I was talking to Persis about this because she had mentioned this interaction you had with this woman at the conference who got so defensive. And I have very similar reactions when I talk about advocacy in the advocacy spaces, right? So, you know, because it gets in the whole kind of thorny conversation of people who think they're white, Iranians are white, right? And I'm here talking about us being people of color because we are impact, because it's true, but also at the very least, no matter what you believe here in America, you are not considered white. So you better recognize the context in which we're living so that you can fight for what's yours and we can do the right thing, right? And at this one conference at this Iranian organization, this woman got up, this is what we're talking about this, and there was a panel of us. Neda Mahbouleh was on there. There was a few other women on there. And she was so offended by this. And she just said, how dare you say these things? Why are you not proud of who you are? Why are you not proud of your own culture and background? And so this kind of attachment to us being white and or this like exceptionalism, I think, you know, our slaves were very happy and well treated versus how they treated them in America. Like that is not even the point, right? So I don't care if your family treated you. The point is that there was slavery, nobody talks about it, right? And so it's just part of this bigger problem of this defensiveness and this like this notion that we are or we're better than this, and let's not connect ourselves, and let's not even like accept fact to the point where we're like grasping at these false theories around Haji Firuz or whatever, right? I kind of deal with this every time something happens and organizations or leaders in our community want to issue a statement saying, you can't do this to Iranians, you can't put a travel ban on us, you can't, you know, make us register. We are amongst the most successful, the most educated, the most community in the US. And it's just like, okay, it's great for us to be very proud of what we've accomplished, but that doesn't mean that you should be afforded more human rights than other people, right? More dignity than other people. So I think that, and then that goes into this conversation I know Roya and Jasmine have brought up in terms of how do we speak with people who come at us with these things, right? And it's not the easiest thing. I think you asked this question earlier. You have to pick your battles, first of all. I think there are people who, even though they might disagree with you, are open and respectful. And then there are people who are just like, you know, in my world, most of those people are Trumpsters, but whatever. Not to get political here, right? So I think you have to pick your battles. I think there are people that are worth spending the energy on, especially if you're having these conversations in your communities and families, and it's not like a professional conference, and you kind of have to talk to everybody, right? But you pick your battles, people you care about, and people who are not going to disrespect you just because they disagree with you. And you know, I think there's just some folks that you say, this is not where I want to spend my energy. But they're very uncomfortable conversations to have. But I think that using the kind of research that Parisa, Neda, Dr. Baghouliza, all these great scholars do is really good. And then also, so using data and research is good. It can be very dry. So you then pair it with with anecdotes, right? You talk about these cases of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin and all these people like doing very ordinary things in their lives and being, and so you couple that like the data and the history and whatever with actual stories that people can actually relate to. And sometimes that method works, but really picking your battles is probably the first thing I would say in terms of having these types of difficult conversations. And I know I kind of went all over the place, but what Parisa was saying really just kind of bubbled all the stuff in my head. So I want to share.
Yes, I really appreciate that advice. I have had similar conversations with some family members and even a Farsi professor of mine in the past year, where I was asked to speak about my experience at a Black Lives Matter action. And I started talking about colorism in our community and like the racial slavery in Iran. And the first thing after I had finished talking that my teacher had told me was, I just wanted to correct you in that we don't have racism in Iran, and we created the Cyrus Scroll. And I see sometimes it goes into this conversation of exceptionalism, like you said, and the ignorance of the lack of acknowledging all how far we've come, but also how if we have a civil rights document, it doesn't mean we're exempt to racism or anti-Black sentiment in our communities, because it's clear in this country it doesn't mean anything. And
right.
I do feel like it's hard when, especially I've heard many people say that there are no Afro-Iranians because it's just the weather in the southern Iran that affects the complexion of the people.
Yeah.
And also that Haji Firuz, he was working, and so it's soot that covers his face. And I just think that a lot of people tend not to realize, like you said, the microaggressions that go into these statements that might feel simple, that might feel like a casual thing to say, but also another step in respectfully correcting maybe your older generations, as difficult as it may be. I think that these stereotypes are so ingrained in our culture, we just don't even realize that they are microaggressions. And I just wanted to look back to our conversation with Tehran, an Afro-Iranian comedian activist that we had, and he pointed out how it's really offensive for him to have people come and ask him like an animal to perform and speak Farsi just for other people's enjoyment. And that's some statement that he hears every single day. And I think a lot of times when people are having those conversations, they don't realize that it can come off as a microaggression. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to also transition into your work, Dr. Kasravi, and talk about your work at the NAACP, and also how you advise us to start being educated as Iranian Americans on our own issues within our community and outside of our community.
I started at the NAACP focusing solely on police shootings and police violence. So I started as a consultant, then I became the senior program officer for police accountability, and then the director of criminal justice program at their national office, which was located in Baltimore. And our portfolio in the criminal justice department focused on a range of issues, policing, of course, being one of the main ones, but also reentry issues, so barriers to folks having been incarcerated, coming back to their communities and trying to establish a life, and all the barriers they face getting their lives back in order and their feet back on the ground. And then, we can have a whole other conversation around how racist the prison system in America is and how it doesn't really match up with, who does more crime. It really has a lot to do with race and also economics and mental illness and drug addiction, but that's a whole other conversation we could have. So policing, reentry, one of our big campaigns was the death penalty, and we were really successful once we got involved. There was a movement to abolish the death penalty in Maryland, and the NAACP got involved when I was the director of the criminal justice program there, and we were able to move the votes in the legislature, particularly the votes that were needed from the Black members of the legislature, state legislature in Maryland, and we were able to abolish the death penalty in Maryland. We did a lot of work on the stop and frisk issue in New York, and we were able to change some of the laws there around racial profiling and police targeting particularly Black people and people of color in New York City, in terms of as an actual method that was advised to them to reduce crime. Of course, it didn't work. The last kind of piece was around sentencing reform, so fighting to end the drug war and changing drug laws, and decriminalizing drug use and addiction, making it more of a public health issue than a criminal justice issue. And so those were some of the things we worked on. Like I said, the death penalty work in Maryland was really, I think, moving for me. It kind of was one of the big wins that I always think about when I think about my time at the NAACP. We were able to get a man who was sentenced to life in prison by the name of John McNeil out of prison. He had shot somebody on his own property who was coming at him with a knife in his pocket in a town where people were actually required by law to own guns, right? So he was Black, and the person he shot was, of course, white, which is often how this stuff works. And so those were some of the major things we did at the NAACP when I was there. In terms of Iranians educating our community, I mean, I think it's just important for our community to be educated on all of it, all of the issues that relate to civil rights and racial injustice and the history of those issues in this country, because only if we understand the entire context can we then fully recognize and understand our position in it, and when things happen to us, why and how and what led to it and what the root is, right? The same reason we're always randomly stopped at the airports when there's travel bans implemented against all, the root is the same reason that Black people are shot in the streets by cops, right? Or killed by white supremacists, right? We have to recognize that history and the context in which we're living. So, and I know that's broad, but I think that the conversations we're having now, the fact that so many organizations and so many institutions are having these conversations, encouraging these conversations, pulling together curriculum around these issues is a major first step. But I think it's a whole, we have to have a whole understanding around these issues in this context, and not just we'll look at immigration because it impacts us. We'll just look at this case of Bijan or Shayan because it happened to us.
It's so interesting and fascinating to hear both of you talk about these areas of expertise. And I think I myself am just learning so much from this conversation and the conversations that we've been able to have through the center. And one thing that I kind of wanted to add is, at least recently, as a result of a lot of the activism that has been going on social media and elsewhere, it's been wonderful for people to recognize that, like, as immigrants, our ability to even be in this country is based on the work of African-American activists. And just understanding that history, and specific to Iranian Americans, the legacy of slavery and the reasons for, as Dr. Vaziri mentioned, it's what's become its irrelevance in our history, and really unpacking and understanding that, I think, is so critical. And especially as a member of the younger generation, developing this vocabulary and approaching these conversations has been really critical for me. And also in using that to look towards the future and what we can do to show up for not only our own community when these issues start to impact us, but for the Black community, for Latinx communities, and for so many more. But kind of related to that, especially showing up and protesting, I know that Jasmine has told me a lot about her experience with this, and hopefully she'll share a little bit about that. But when a lot of the times when talking about protest, especially recently related to Black Lives Matter, what I've witnessed in conversations has been a reluctance, or excuse me, not reluctance, a hesitance to talk about, to engage politically with these issues. And I'm curious to understand from both of your perspectives, Dr. Kasravi, perhaps from how race and racism affecting Iranians through foreign policy in the last 40 years since the largest kind of phase of immigration, how that could be impacting responses to protests like that of Black Lives Matter, and perhaps how trauma from the Iranian Revolution or from the state of politics in Iran could be impacting really like our ability or our interest in the next step of actually showing up at protests or advocating actively. So moving past the education and really entering that space.
So two things come to mind. I wanted to address, I think you mentioned kind of the hesitance to get involved politically, and the immigration, connecting the immigration issue to kind of what's happening now. I think that, I think definitely, particularly for the younger generation that I know and I work with, that connection has been very easily made because they understand that the same reason that we had a Muslim ban or that we had the national, NCERS program, for those of us who are old enough to remember, the post 9/11 roundups and all these kind of foreign policy induced, domestic impact on our communities is the same root as the problems that Black folks are complaining about and marching about. So I think there's definite recognition, but I don't think for all of our community that recognition is still there. So I do think there's a lot of work for us to do. I think that, and we don't have really, and we can get into it in, I guess, the Q&A period, but I think it's important when we have these conversations around issues of race in America and racism and Black Lives Matter to talk about institutional racism. So not just like, individual acts of racism or individual moments that have caused upheavals, but the reason that so many people are angry is because this kind of racism is built into the institutions that govern our country, right? So, and then to the point, I'm kind of keeping it brief because I know I just want to make sure there's enough time to do Q&A, and if Parisa has anything to add. I think the generational trauma, I think, is real. I think that it is real that a lot of our parents and our elders, not all, I think there's some folks who are really open, who maybe were politically active themselves and really, benefited and really thought that that was something that's worthwhile, right? But I think for the most part, a lot of us have heard, oh, don't get involved with politics, oh, So I do think it's important to recognize that we have to understand where folks are coming from and their experiences in Iran, whether they were impacted by the revolution, whether they were minorities and discriminated, whether they had to escape the country, and all they want to do is like settle roots and provide a home for their children. And so that's not to say that should be the reason to be like, okay, I'm not going to get involved, but just developing an understanding of where they're coming from. But it's also recognizing that it's not just unique to our community, right? I've heard this perspective from folks in the Black community that sometimes they look back and they're like, wow, a lot of the children of the civil rights movement sort of kind of took a step back. And it's often because parents were trying to just make a better life. We dealt with that, right? We got the Civil Rights Act passed. We got, so trying to shield their kids from that, I think it's not just unique to our community, but I think we have to understand the uniqueness of the experiences of people, our elders who went through the revolution and the war and the immigration experience. And I have a cousin who always says, I think he says, don't quote me on this, but I think he says something like, besides like death and dying, immigration is the biggest disruptor in someone's life, right? So we have to we can't understand the heaviness of that. So I'm just saying, don't let it be like, oh, whatever. Try to understand it, but don't let it stop you from doing what you believe is right, because you're living in a different reality than our parents or grandparents were.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think this question of meeting people where they're at is important. And I do often think about why it's so hard to have conversations about anti-Blackness with older Iranians. I mean, it's true, it's not just a generational thing, but at the same time, it is part of it. Age is part of it, because, you know, when I talk about generation, I'm also thinking about people who grew up in Iran during the Pahlavi era, right? People who were educated under that system at the height of nationalism, which was very much a racial project. There's this academic, Raisa Ebrahimi, he came up with this term dislocative nationalism. And I think it's a pretty good term for what it was, because that, you know, the 20th century was very much about kind of making Iran this exceptional place, this exception to the Middle East, right? That it was not like these other backward countries. And so this idea that Iranians are white, that they're Aryan, that they're Indo-Europe, they're somehow racially connected to Europeans, this is a real thing. I think, you know, for those of us who have either grown up in the United States or outside of Iran or spent a lot of time, we've pretty much come to take it for granted that race is a constructed category. It's not actually a real biological thing. When I talk to people who either live in Iran or have experience with people who do, they say, you know, people still believe that this is real. Race is, nejad is a real category that people believe in. So I think there are really different levels where people are at with this conversation. And I think especially with the generation that grew up, you know, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, I think ideas about whiteness, Iranianness and whiteness are very, very deeply rooted. And they're not just these superficial ideas that people came up with on their own and that they can just as easily throw away. So therefore, I think it's important for us to also be aware of this history and maybe push people about, you know, interrogate their own investments. What is it? Why do you think this? You know, what made you believe that this is reality? And so one thing that I notice a lot, people don't know very much about anti-Blackness in the Iranian context, so they're often confused when I bring it up because they're familiar with anti-Arabness, for example. That was very much a big thing during Pahlavi nationalism. So they say, well, what, you know, anti-Arabness is the big thing. We didn't really have anti-Blackness. We don't really have Black people. And I think, you know, part of what I don't find convincing about the way that anti-Blackness gets subsumed into other kinds of racism and other kinds of ethnic discrimination is like, so that doesn't answer for me why people in Arab countries also have very denigrating language to talk about Black people. It doesn't explain their histories of African slavery. It doesn't explain why Turkish people have denigrating language to talk about Black people. Like, what is it about anti-Blackness that makes it a very global phenomenon in the way that, you know, something like Arabness is not, anti-Arabness is not quite like that. It exists in certain locations. So, I mean, going back, sorry, I feel like I'm going a little bit all over the place here, but I want to circle back to your question about moving forward and thinking about frameworks for doing so. And I think framework is a really good word. And I was thinking about that with regard to the question. I think, again, there's this question of who we're including when we talk about Iranians in general. And Persis brought up this, you know, the slogan that she had, Iranian Americans for Black Lives at the Black Lives Matter protests. And I know people who are sort of upset by that, you know, because what does it mean to say Iranians for Black lives? What it presumes is that Iranians are not Black. You know, like, what would it mean to be a Black Iranian holding up a sign like that? It's like Black Iranian for Black lives, right? It's kind of a paradox. So I think, you know, really rethinking our frameworks, the way that we articulate language about our own identity, the way that we think about our own identity. is part of the task going forward. And I know it's challenging because we don't even have Black consciousness in our Black communities in Iran, right? There's even a taboo around calling oneself Black. Like, people don't embrace being Black people who are Iranian. They don't, and I'm not speaking for everyone. I'm not necessarily speaking for people in diaspora, but I do know that this is the case, not only in Iran, but other Southwestern Asian countries where there are Black populations, Black communities that are very much the minority. It's not a positive association. So how do we make space for changing this, right? How do we make it possible for Blackness to be something that we celebrate, that is part of our identity, and is not just something outside of us that we're marching for, but when we're marching for Black people, we're marching for ourselves. I think these are questions that we can think about moving forward. And like Niaz, I'm very encouraged by the younger generation. You, Jasmine, Roya, thank you for thinking to have this panel, for organizing this panel. I think I have a lot of optimism that things will change based on the kinds of work that you guys are sort of exemplifying here.
Thank you so much, both of you. I wanted to first off say that we're going to open up the chat for questions. And I wanted to say that, to reiterate what both Parisa and Niaz have been saying, that for us to reach equality and equity, we have to first liberate our Black brothers and sisters, and Black liberation is the key to liberation to all of our struggles. And it is really important to do the work and educate ourselves and not hold that responsibility to Black people to educate ourselves. And so as people of color, we do hold a really unique space in the United States as folks who hold white privilege in certain contexts but are racialized in others. And I know it's really difficult, as someone who has had conversations with numerous family members and other Iranian individuals or immigrants or folks in the diaspora, to start these conversations. But we really encourage you to see this as a sign to push forward, and that you're not alone in the fight to have these conversations. And we will be posting a little infographic soon with some helpful translations in Farsi to start the conversation on, in simple terms like police brutality and anti-Black sentiment and things that you might not normally know how to translate. And we hope that you continue to stay tuned in our conversation. And we're now opening up the floor to questions. And if you have any questions, please address it to Dr. Vaziri, Dr. Kasravi, or Roya and myself, and we will be choosing a couple questions to go over.
Again, thank both of you for everything that you've shared with us. And something that has really stood out to me is that even in these kinds of forums where we're educating ourselves and hoping to involve our community in this education, there's still so many different pathways to explore. As Dr. Vaziri, you mentioned the anti-Arab sentiment, and how, when I think of that, I also think a lot about the persecution of different racial and religious minorities in Iran, and how our attitudes towards Black individuals and an irrelevance of the history of slavery and the country's history with race is also, it has not only hurt generations of people, but continues to hurt people because some of those same frameworks of discrimination and violence against those communities are currently being used. And not just in Iran, but in the diaspora. I've talked to many people who hold negative sentiments towards Baha'i people or so many of the different religious and racial minorities of Iran. And what it seems to do really is erase the diversity that, as both of you have really touched on, is so critical that we embrace, so that we know that in conversations around dismantling anti-Blackness, that's something that is helping members of our own community that we have erased and neglected for too long. And yeah, so I'm just so grateful to have this opportunity to learn about all of this and really learn where I need to direct my attention and involve myself in being a more active ally and going to protests and engaging with these issues more. Yeah, and so I also just wanted to mention, it looks like we don't have any live questions now, so I just wanted to reiterate that we are accepting those, and if anyone in the audience has any questions for any of the panelists, they are welcome to include them in the chat, and we'll hopefully be able to address them. But while we wait for those questions, one part of Dr. Vaziri, your research that we haven't talked too much specifically about, but I'm interested to learn some more about, is the depictions of Black individuals in visual culture in Iran, and kind of the history and implications of that relating to anti-Blackness in the diaspora and in Iran.
I mean, I'm still working on this book. Hopefully it'll be done in a few years or so. But part of the book is just looking at various eras in which filmmakers tried to, not necessarily tried, but depicted, whether they were conscious of it or not, Blackness in Iran. So for example, there's this one chapter that I've also published separately as an article that talks about documentary filmmaking in the 1960s. So there's this period of ethnographic filmmaking where filmmakers were kind of just moving all around the country and making documentaries about life in various villages, different kinds of cultural communities that existed throughout the country. And one of those areas was in the South, where there was an African descendant community. So the film that I wrote about is about this a healing ritual. It's called Zar, and it's considered to be a sort of trace of African slavery, in the sense that it's been disseminated through the generations of African slave descendants. And I'm just trying to think about what these kinds of depictions are doing, given that they are in some way connected to the state apparatus. So all of these documentary films were actually funded by the state. So we have this sort of conflicting narrative, right? On the one hand, it's like during the Pahlavi era, there was this desire to homogenize the country and eliminate diversity, say by making Persian the national language and teaching that in schools, and discouraging people who spoke other languages from speaking their languages. And on the other hand, you have this sort of gesture of documenting this cultural diversity and showcasing it. So for me, I found this very paradoxical in an interesting way, and was trying to explore what this documentary meant during this time period, and also its connection to the development of modernism. Sorry, so you can interrupt me at any time if you have a live question, because this is something I might go on about if no one stops me.
We have one question now. So this is from Adrian that asks, to what extent does white proximity affect the mindsets of light-skinned Persians, and how can we use the resulting privilege to be better allies to the marginalized?
I think it's a great question, because to me, it sort of highlights how even the choice, like to be a person of color is a choice for many of us as Iranians. We can deny that. We can call ourselves, even though we're usually wrong. I mean, we are wrong, as Niaz was saying, and I totally agree with her. We're not considered white in the US context by people who are white in an Anglo-Saxon European sense, right? We're not that kind of white. We're definitely not a model white. But it's still a choice. It's a privilege, I think, that we get to say, I'm a person of color. So if I were a Black Iranian, I would not have that choice. It's pretty clear. I'm not a person of color. I'm a Black person. So I think, first of all, I think it is important to acknowledge that it's privileged to be a person of color. But when you are white passing and you make the choice to be white passing, that is not to identify as a person of color at all. I think addressing instances of racism, because they usually tend to happen more in white spaces, spaces where people are white passing. I think both kind of being proximate, but also knowing you're not on the inside puts you in the position to be able to interrupt certain things that happen that would not always necessarily be interrupted if someone were not there to say, hey, what are you doing? You know, what are you saying? You know, I was interested, and I'm sure Niaz will have more to say about that, but I was interested in what you were saying, Jasmine, about your people in your generation being sort of reluctant to have these conversations. And I'm curious to hear more about why you think that that's happening in your generation. I mean, I already talked about why I think it happens in older generations, but it's still surprising that it's continuing on.
I personally feel like with social media, there's a lot of performative activism I see with a lot of people who are my classmates, and I believe that some people just with Black Lives Matter becoming trendy again, kind of what you were touching on before, Niaz, it has become kind of like they have to post and if they don't, then it's bad and it just looks bad. And so there's a lot of performative activism, just posting things, just posting the picture of a change.org petition but not doing anything about it, not showing up to like different protests, not speaking up when there are injustices around us, and not having the difficult conversations. And from one of my experiences that I had personally with a classmate of mine, they just felt like their relationships with their friends were not the kind that they could have political conversations. And I was kind of confused what she meant by that, because I hear that word being thrown around a lot, and a lot of times it's not referring to like the two-party system and anything. And I was kind of saying to her that our existence on this campus is political, and that everything can be under the umbrella of politics. And I think that's something that I've had the privilege of understanding because I'm in higher education and I'm in the ethnic studies department. And sometimes I feel certain people who don't have the access to the academic text that I've been privileged enough to read, that they don't realize the importance of having these conversations as like people of color who aren't Black individuals. And I think that it's not even, I don't know, sometimes I feel like they don't realize the weight of what they're doing, and that it actually takes away from everything by just performing only when people are watching in terms of social media. And I noticed that this particular person that I was having this conversation with only started to speak up when other eyes were on them, or when the conversation turned to the wake of the George Floyd protests, but not before, when we were trying to have these conversations in a club setting and everything. So I do think it's hard to speak up when this happens, like also in reference to the question, especially if you're in majority white spaces, which I spend a lot of my time growing up in. But I believe because we have this privilege in some contexts, and that a lot of our darker skinned brothers and sisters might not feel comfortable speaking up, those are the times that we need to speak up, take up space, use our bodies when we can in actions and protests. And hopefully we can start to change this so that it isn't just a blip in the timeline and it's not just another hashtag.
I think just to build on that, I think that, to what extent, I can't give you a percentage. I am sure that it impacts the mindset of light-skinned Iranians. It also depends on the individual person and their perspective and what types of white people you're hanging out with, But I think it's important to recognize that oftentimes, because people see with their eyes and they perceive, oftentimes, in my experience, I could say something and it would be taken differently than if my Black colleague said it, right? So it's important to recognize not that you're taking up their space, but recognizing that your privilege allows you to say and do things to help the movement and not be in the spotlight, because I think that's also the biggest mistake we make in moments like this is, okay, if this was about a protest about a war with Iran, yes, Iranians should be front and center, right? This is about the killing of unarmed Black people by police in America, for example. And I can say something because I'm Iranian, I'm not Black, I'm not, you know, I'm a little pigmented, but, you know, people will take it differently, right? But my role isn't to be in the spotlight and like lead this movement. My role is to speak up when I can use my voice to further the movement, but also be really supporting those who need to be leading the movement to play that role. And I think in terms of, you know, Parisa mentioning, I was talking to a student group on a campus, this was last year, and I was trying to get them, 2 years ago, trying to get them engaged in these issues and the case here in Orange County. And she was telling me, well, there's kind of two Iranian student groups on campus. One is like the partiers, and then there's the ones that are like socially conscious. But you know, at the same time, it's like, okay, that's also good because there weren't those people when I was, you know, going to school. So you guys have a little bit more to work with. And, you know, at the end of the day, parents who raise kids with a certain mindset that they have, you're going to get some kids who are going to veer towards being more closed-minded to this stuff. So we work with what we've got.
There were some other questions. Thank you both for sharing that. There were some questions that I think would be interesting to kind of discuss. So there's two of them kind of related to each other. So Janya asked, how does colonialism and imperialism, or how has colonialism and imperialism contributed to racism or anti-Blackness in the Iranian and South Asian communities and their diaspora? And related to that, Mia is curious, for Dr. Vaziri, would you consider Iran, or perhaps the Persian Empire, as having been a colonial power? And if so, to what extent is this driving anti-Blackness today?
So with regard to the question of colonialism and imperialism, I mean, these are important histories, right? It's definitely the case that it was largely because of the development of something like a theory of Indo-European languages and the Aryan race that our 20th century nationalism became what it was, right? And Iran, you know, as you know, was never directly colonized, but it was certainly greatly influenced by imperial powers. You know, at the same time, though, I'm sort of not one of those people that likes to blame everything on colonialism and outside things that happened to us. I think there were a lot of people who made the decision to embrace these ideas, and we have to ask why they decided to embrace these ideas and why it became sort of institutionalized. It's like people can't force you to believe something that you don't inherently already feel some way about. And it's also the case that our history of slavery is very old. I mean, it's true that the research that's been coming out recently really focuses on the modern period, but that's simply because those historians were only able to access archives pertaining to the modern period. And those are very problematic archives. Much of that scholarship, again, not just in Iran, but also in the Ottoman Empire, is kind of drawn from things that British consuls were writing to each other in the Persian Gulf, because the British were patrolling the Persian Gulf in the 19th century to abolish the slave trade. So I think it's easy to say that anti-Blackness is something that comes from the outside. And that's what many scholars say, we'll just completely wholesale attribute our racialized nationalism to imperialism, European ideas. I think that's not very convincing to me. It doesn't really explain why we have, you know, medieval Muslim geographers writing about Africans as if they're not humans, right? Read Ibn Khaldun from the 14th century, go see what he has to say about Africa and African people. So I think that for sure, the development of the concept of race in the 18th century in Germany, in other European countries, definitely helped to reify certain categories and certain ideas that Iranians had about themselves. But I would be reluctant to say that we could just attribute this entire history to that because it predates it. And in fact, there are people who will even say, you know, if you think about the chronology of slavery with the Indian Ocean slave trades preceding the Atlantic slave trade and the kinds of connections that were made in the Iberian Peninsula with European encounters with, you know, Muslims engaging in African slavery, there's a sort of transaction going on during the medieval period that has been really overlooked. And so we tend to think of everything as coming to us from the outside without really interrogating the longevity of these ideas in this history.
I just wanted to wrap things up a little bit. We're just at the 6:30 mark, but I really wanted to thank both of you so much for accepting our invitation and engaging in this conversation. I know this means a lot to me and Roya, and these are a lot of conversations and things that have been on both of our minds for a really long time. And it feels really freeing to be having these conversations and working through some intergenerational trauma and having these conversations that many people might have been afraid to before. So I really appreciate that. And I want to tell everyone that if they're interested in continuing the conversation, it doesn't need to stop there. And we would love to engage with you. We are going to be posting a reading list soon, and we wanted to give out our email in case anyone was interested. If people are interested, we might be putting together a little book club. And so if you want to join this book club, our email is Iranian Diaspora Studies at sfsu.edu. Again, our email is Iranian Diaspora Studies at sfsu.edu. And the next part of our series is going to be October 14th, where we will be meeting with different members of the community and talking about how important it is to vote in the upcoming elections. Also wanted to just note that if you haven't already, please fill out your census. It's really important to just write in Iranian. It makes a huge difference, and every write-in really counts. So please spread the word. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Roya, June, in the center. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
And I want to say thank you so much to Parisa and Niaz for spending your afternoon or evening, since you're in New York with us. We really appreciate all the work that you've done up until now. And I think you've given us lots of things to think about. And hopefully we can sort of parlay this into some more serious conversation and action. And I also want to say thank you to our wonderful summer fellows, Roya Ahmadi and Jasmine Javaheri. It was really their baby, and I think they did a superb job. I think you would agree, right, Parisa?
That's right. That's right. Thank you
Amazing.
so much, guys.
Thank
Keep
you
it up.
both very much.
And you give us a lot of
Merci.
hope, and boy, do we need it. So thank you. And thank you again to Shahryar, who's doing the channels back there, and also to Nick. And stay tuned.